October 29th, 1941. Zagorsk Military Airfield, 60 kilometers northeast of Moscow. Ground crew members watched as Junior Lieutenant Boris Kovzan's MiG-3 interceptor touched down on the dirt strip, trailing smoke from its engine cowling. The mechanics ran toward the aircraft, expecting another training accident. Kovzan had earned a reputation. In the 6 months since graduating from Odessa Military Aviation School, he damaged 3 aircraft in landing mishaps. His squadron commander had threatened him with transfer to a ground unit. Too many bent propellers, too many collapsed landing gear struts. But when the canopy slid back, Kovzan wasn't apologizing. He was smiling. The crew chief climbed onto the wing and looked down at the damage. The leading edge of the right wing showed deep gouges. Metal fragments were embedded in the air intake. Then his blood ran cold when he looked at the nose section. Streaks of German field gray paint, shreds of fabric bearing black crosses. Messerschmitt Bf 110, Kovzan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. Reconnaissance variant. I ran out of ammunition after the first 109. This one was getting away. The mechanic stared at him. You rammed it? I hit it from below. Propeller into his tail section. He went down near the rail yard. What the Soviet command didn't realize that October morning was that they'd just witnessed the first of 4 aerial ramming attacks that one pilot would not only survive, but perfect into a repeatable technique. While other nations considered ramming a desperate, usually fatal last resort, Boris Kovzan was about to prove that controlled aerial collision could be weaponized, studied, and, impossibly, survived again and again. For 4 months, the German blitzkrieg had shattered Soviet defenses from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Operation Barbarossa had caught Stalin's air force on the ground. On June 22, 1941, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,200 Soviet aircraft in the first day. Most of them bombed on their airfields before pilots could reach the cockpits. By autumn, the survivors faced a brutal mathematical reality. Soviet fighters were outclassed. The Polikarpov Hour-16, nicknamed Ishak, or Donkey, had been revolutionary in 1934 as the world's first low-wing monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear. But in 1941, its maximum speed of 304 miles per hour couldn't catch German bombers at altitude. Its 2 7.62mm Shkaz machine guns and single 12.7mm Berezin couldn't punch through armored cockpits. The newer MiG-3 interceptors showed promise, capable of 407 miles per hour at high altitude, but carried the same inadequate armament, 1 12.7mm machine gun and 2 7.62mm guns. Pilots emptied their ammunition loads without seeing bombers fall. The statistics backed up the terror. German Bf 109F fighters dominated at all altitudes with speeds exceeding 390 miles per hour and nose-mounted 20mm cannons that could saw a Soviet fighter in half. The twin-engine Bf 110 heavy fighters carried 4 7.92mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, plus a rear-facing defensive gun. Junkers Ju-88 bombers, flying in protective formations, could absorb hundreds of machine gun rounds and continue their missions over Moscow, Leningrad, and industrial targets. Soviet fighter pilots described the frustration in combat reports. Major Ivan Kozhedub, who would become the top Soviet ace with 62 confirmed kills, wrote, "We chased them, we shot at them, we watched our tracers bounce off their armor, and still they dropped their bombs and flew home." For every German aircraft, the VVS, Voyeno-Vozdushny Sily, the Soviet Air Forces, managed to shoot down in the summer of 1941, they lost 3 fighters. Pilots were dying in cockpits, burning alive, or jumping without parachutes rather than face the flames. Those who survived one sortie often didn't survive the next. The average combat life expectancy for a Soviet fighter pilot in those first months was 11 missions. What made this situation particularly devastating was timing. Soviet factories were evacuating eastward ahead of German advances, disrupting production of new aircraft. The Yak-1 and La-5 fighters entering service carried better armament, a 20mm Schwacke cannon supplementing machine guns, but production numbers couldn't replace losses. By October, as German forces approached Moscow's outskirts, Soviet pilots were flying obsolete aircraft against a technologically superior enemy. Intelligence desperately needed answers. How could Soviet pilots defend Moscow when their bullets barely scratched German bombers? How could they force the Luftwaffe to pay a higher price when ammunition simply wasn't enough? The answer, when it came, was so radical that most commanders initially refused to believe it possible. Not more ammunition, not better guns, not waiting for superior aircraft that might arrive too late to save Moscow. The answer was the aircraft itself, transformed from a gun platform into a 4,000-pound kinetic weapon traveling at 300 miles per hour. What military theorists would later call taran, the Russian word for battering ram, had been attempted before in World War I and even earlier in the Russo-Japanese War. But those had been desperate, usually suicidal attacks by pilots with nothing left to lose. What Boris Kovzan would prove over the next 10 months was something no aviation manual had ever considered: that ramming could be controlled, calculated, and survived. That a pilot could deliberately crash into an enemy, destroy the target, and land his damaged fighter to fly again. It shouldn't have been possible. The physics seemed to guarantee mutual destruction. But Kovzan had something German pilots didn't account for: a willingness to accept damage they considered fatal, and the skill to exploit weaknesses in aircraft designed to survive gunfire, not collision. German bomber. Crews approaching Moscow that autumn dismissed Soviet fighters as nuisances. Flight logs from Kampfgeschwader 3 described ineffective harassment and poor marksmanship. Intelligence assessments noted Soviet ammunition shortages and inadequate gunnery training. Luftwaffe pilots joked that Russian fighters were more dangerous to themselves than to German formations. They weren't entirely wrong. Soviet losses from operational accidents nearly matched combat casualties. Young pilots rushed through abbreviated training programs, crashed on takeoff. They misjudged landings. They spun out of turns at low altitude. The very aircraft supposed to defend Soviet cities became emblems of the Red Army's desperation. Boris Kovzan embodied this reputation. His personnel file documented 3 landing accidents in his first 6 months of service: 1 collapsed landing gear, 1 overshot runway requiring aircraft recovery from a ditch, 1 hard landing that required propeller and engine cowling replacement. His squadron commander had written, "Lacks judgment in approach, overcorrects, recommend additional training or reassignment to transport duties." What the Luftwaffe couldn't see from their bomber cockpits was the shift happening in Soviet fighter regiments. Desperation was breeding innovation. When conventional tactics failed, pilots experimented. When ammunition ran out mid-combat, they didn't simply break off and return to base. On June 22nd, the war's first day, Lieutenant Pyotr Nesterov in an I-16 had rammed a German bomber when his guns jammed. He died in the collision, but took the bomber with him. Over the next 4 months, 24 Soviet pilots executed similar attacks. Propaganda celebrated them as ultimate sacrifices, heroes who gave everything for the motherland. German intelligence noted these incidents but categorized them as desperation moves by damaged aircraft or pilots who'd run out of ammunition, irrational behavior by an inferior force. Soviet fighters willing to die to destroy one bomber weren't a tactical threat. They were removing themselves from the order of battle. The exchange rate favored Germany. What they didn't realize was that not all ramming pilots were dying. Junior Lieutenant Viktor Talalikin rammed a Heinkel He-111 bomber over Moscow on August 7th, destroying the bomber's tail section with his propeller, then successfully bailed out at low altitude and survived. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union Award and returned to combat, scoring 8 more victories before his death in October. The possibility of survivable ramming attacks created a problem German bomber formations had never faced in Western Europe: Soviet fighters that became more dangerous after running out of ammunition. A British or American pilot, guns empty, would break off and return to base. A Soviet pilot, guns empty, might accelerate into a collision attack, but survivability remained inconsistent. Most ramming attacks still killed both pilots. The technique lacked doctrine, training, or systematic study. It was desperation weaponized, nothing more. Each attack was unique, improvised, impossible to replicate. Then came Boris Kovzan, the pilot who couldn't land safely. The pilot commanders wanted to transfer out of fighters. The pilot who was about to teach the Soviet Air Force and terrify German bomber crews, that crashing could be as precise a skill as gunnery. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about Soviet aerial ramming tactics. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about Boris Kovzan and the Taran before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The morning of October 29th, 1941, began as another desperate scramble. German reconnaissance aircraft had been probing Moscow's air defenses for days, photographing anti-aircraft positions, mapping fighter airfields, identifying targets for the coming bomber offensive. Soviet intelligence needed those reconnaissance flights stopped. Every photo the Germans took meant more accurate bombing, more civilian deaths, more disrupted production. Boris Kovzan lifted off from Zagorsk at 08:47 hours in his MiG-3. One of 4 fighters scrambled to intercept reported enemy aircraft northeast of Moscow. The MiG-3 was the newest fighter available, a sleek interceptor with a McCullen AM-35A inline engine producing 1,350 horsepower. At altitude, it could reach 407 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest fighters in Soviet service. But speed meant nothing without enough firepower. Kovzan's aircraft carried 300 rounds for the single 12.7-meter Berezin UBS machine gun mounted above the engine, and 375 rounds each for the 2 7.62-meter Shkaz guns flanking it. Against armored German aircraft, those 1,050 rounds provided perhaps 15 seconds of continuous fire, if everything functioned perfectly. At 5,000 meters altitude, Kovzan spotted them. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109F fighters escorting a reconnaissance aircraft. The escorts were hunting for Soviet interceptors, weaving protective patterns above and behind their charge. The physics of the engagement favored Germany. The Bf-109F carried a 15mm or 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, supplemented by 2 7.92mm machine guns synchronized through the propeller arc. More critically, German pilots had 6 months of combat experience and superior tactical training. Kovzan had youth, rage, and nothing to lose. He dove on the formation from the sun, standard textbook approach, and opened fire on the trailing Bf-109 at 400 meters range. His first burst struck the German fighter's wing root and fuselage. Pieces flew off. The Messerschmitt rolled left, trailing smoke, and dropped away toward the ground. His ammunition counter already showed 200 rounds expended. Less than 10 seconds of firing remained. The remaining 3 Bf-109s scattered and came around for him. Radio discipline collapsed into shouted warnings from his wingmen. The sky became a tumbling blur of earth and clouds as Kovzan threw his MiG through evasive turns. G-forces compressed his vision into tunnel sight. he heard the hammering of German cannon rounds passing through the space his aircraft had occupied a half-second before. Then he saw his opening. The reconnaissance aircraft, a Bf-110 twin-engine heavy fighter configured for photo reconnaissance, had broken away from the dogfight and was diving northeast, trying to escape back toward German lines at maximum speed. Kovzan broke off from the swirling dogfight and dove after it, pushing his throttle to the stop. The MiG-3 accelerated through 450 kilometers per hour. The Bf-110, heavier and less aerodynamic in its reconnaissance configuration, couldn't match the dive speed. At 800 meters range, Kovzan opened fire with his remaining ammunition. Tracers arced toward the fleeing German aircraft. A few rounds sparked off the armored rear fuselage. The Bf-110's defensive gunner fired back. He could see the muzzle flashes from the 7.92-meter MG-15 machine gun in the rear cockpit. His guns went silent. Bolt locked back. Ammunition exhausted. The Bf-110 was still flying, still photographing, still escaping with intelligence that would kill Soviet civilians. Kovzan had seconds to decide. Return to base with a single kill and watch the reconnaissance aircraft escape, or try something that pilots whispered about but few survived. He pushed the throttle forward and dove steeper. The airspeed indicator climbed past 550 kilometers per hour. The MiG-3 began to shudder as it approached its structural limits. The Bf-110 grew larger in his windscreen. He could see the rear gunner tracking him, see muzzle flashes, hear rounds punching through his aircraft's thin aluminum skin. A control cable parted somewhere behind him. The stick felt different, mushy on one axis. At 50 meters, still accelerating, Kovzan pulled back slightly on the stick and kicked in right rudder. The MiG's nose lifted. Its propeller arc, all 3.1 meters of spinning metal blade traveling at supersonic tip speed, rose toward the Bf-110's tail section. The impact lasted perhaps 1/10 of a second. The propeller blades struck the Bf-110's vertical stabilizer and rudder at a closing speed exceeding 700 kilometers per hour. Metal screamed. The German aircraft's tail assembly disintegrated in a shower of aluminum fragments and fabric. The Bf-110 pitched violently nose down and entered an uncontrollable spin. Kovzan's MiG bucked like a living thing trying to throw him. The propeller had absorbed catastrophic damage. Bent blades, cracked hub, the entire engine shaking itself apart against its mounts. Engine temperature spiked. Oil pressure dropped. The windscreen cracked from vibration. But the wings were intact. The control surfaces still responded. Altitude, 4,200 meters and dropping. Enough height to glide. If the engine didn't tear itself free and make the aircraft unflyable, he pulled the throttle to idle, stopped the dying engine, and began a powerless descent toward Zagorsk. No radio. The electrical system had failed. No engine. The propeller hung motionless, bent blades windmilling slightly in the slipstream. Just the whisper of wind over aluminum and the steady altimeter unwind toward the ground. At 300 meters altitude, he had his approach lined up. At 100 meters, he could see faces of the ground crew looking up. At 20 meters, he flared for landing. The MiG-3 touched down hard, bounced once, and rolled to a stop, trailing dust. Kovzan climbed out. The mechanics ran toward him, expecting to find another crashed aircraft added to his record. Instead, they found a technique that would be repeated 636 times by the Soviet Air Force over the next 4 years. A method that would send German bomber crews back with reports of suicidal Russian fighters that were neither suicidal nor random, but calculated weapons no armor could stop. Within 48 hours, Boris Kovzan's combat report reached the desk of General Pavel Zygarev, commander of the Soviet Air Forces. The document described in technical detail what shouldn't have been possible: a controlled collision that destroyed the enemy and left the attacking pilot alive. Test pilots at the State Red Banner Air Force Research Institute analyzed the wreckage of Kovzan's MiG-3. What they discovered challenged assumptions about aerial combat. The propeller had absorbed most of the impact energy. Its rotational momentum, spinning at 2,200 RPM with blade tips exceeding the speed of sound, created a buzzsaw effect against the Bf-110's tail structure. The German aircraft's vertical stabilizer and rudder, designed to withstand air pressure loads, couldn't resist the concentrated force of multiple impacts along their leading edges. Most critically, the attack from below had protected Kovzan's cockpit and engine from direct collision. The MiG's propeller extended forward of the engine, cowling by nearly 1 meter. By striking the enemy's tail with his propeller arc while his own fuselage remained clear, Kovzan had effectively used his aircraft as a 4,000-pound missile with a cutting blade. Engineers calculated the forces involved. At 550 kilometers per hour closing speed, the propeller blades delivered impact energy equivalent to a 37mm cannon shell, but spread across multiple blade strikes per second. Against tail surfaces designed for aerodynamic loads, not ballistic impact, the effect was catastrophic. Remove the tail control surfaces, and even the most heavily armored bomber becomes unflyable. What made this particular revelation so valuable was survivability. Previous ramming attacks had typically involved head-on collisions, or wing-to-wing impacts that destroyed both aircraft. Viktor Talalekin's celebrated ramming in August 1941 had severed his I-16's tail section, forcing him to bail out. Kovzan's technique preserved his aircraft's structural integrity enough to glide to landing. The VVS Air Force Academy began documenting the technique. Intelligence bulletins distributed to fighter regiments in November 1941 outlined the methodology. When ammunition is exhausted, an enemy bomber is escaping, the taran attack from below offers highest probability of pilot survival. Approach from 6 o'clock, low position, close to 50 meters or less. Pull up sharply to bring propeller arc into contact with enemy tail surfaces. Immediately reduce throttle and prepare for emergency landing. This technique has been successfully demonstrated and should be considered when conventional attack methods have failed. Soviet propaganda seized on ramming attacks as evidence of superior will. Posters showed fighters smashing into bombers with slogans, "Ramming, the weapon of heroes." But behind the propaganda, the Air Force was systematically studying how to make desperation tactics repeatable. The psychological impact on German bomber crews proved immediate. Luftwaffe combat reports from November 1941 onward noted Soviet fighters that continued to attack after ammunition exhaustion and deliberately collided with our aircraft. Bomber formations began flying higher, faster, with additional escort fighters, all responses that reduced bombing accuracy and effectiveness. German tactical bulletins warned crews, Russian fighters may attempt ramming attack when out of ammunition. Maintain defensive fire until enemy fighter breaks away. Do not assume damaged Russian aircraft will disengage. The Luftwaffe had fought over Spain, Poland, France, and Britain without encountering an enemy that weaponized its own aircraft. The Eastern Front was proving different. For Boris Kovzan, the successful ramming attack validated rather than terminated his career. Instead of being transferred out of fighters for repeated crashes, he was promoted and given newer aircraft. His October 29th attack became a case study taught at Soviet aviation schools. What no one predicted, not his commanders, not German intelligence, not Kovzan himself, was that this wouldn't be his last ramming attack. It was merely the first of 4 that would redefine the boundaries between courage and calculation, between suicide and survival, between desperation and doctrine. Boris Kovzan executed his second taran on February 21, 1942, ramming a Junkers-Ju-88 bomber over Torsok while flying a Yak-1 fighter. Again, he survived. Again, he landed the damaged aircraft. His third ramming came on July 9, 1942, near Luftwaffe, another Bf-110, another Yak-1, another successful forced landing. By this point, Soviet propaganda had begun circulating his story. The pilot who'd nearly been cashiered for crashing too. Much was becoming a hero of the Soviet Union candidate, but Air Force leadership hesitated. 3 ramming attacks suggested either extraordinary skill or extraordinary recklessness. They awarded him the Order of the Red Banner instead and watched to see if he would survive. His fourth and final Taran attack, on August 13, 1942, nearly killed him. Flying an La-5 fighter on patrol near Staraya Russa, Kovzan encountered a formation of 7 Ju-88 bombers escorted by 6 Bf-110 heavy fighters. Alone, outgunned, he attacked anyway. A Bf-109 joined the fight. The intelligence report had missed enemy fighters at higher altitude. Cannon rounds from the Messerschmitt tore through Kovzan's cockpit. 120mm shell fragment struck his right eye, destroying it instantly. Blind in one eye, bleeding, unable to bail out due to weakness, Kovzan did what he'd practiced 3 times before. He aimed his dying aircraft at the nearest Ju-88 and rammed it. The collision tore open his cockpit canopy. The blast of 300-mile-per-hour air ejected him from the aircraft. He fell 6,000 meters without pulling his ripcord, unconscious from blood loss and shock. The parachute deployed automatically at low altitude. He landed in a marsh on a collective farm with a fractured leg, fractured arm, multiple broken ribs, and a destroyed right eye. Partisan fighters found him, unconscious, sinking into the bog. They carried him to a field hospital, then to Moscow, where surgeons worked for 10 hours to save his life. He woke up on August 24, 1943, more than a year after the ramming attack. The Supreme Soviet had declared him a hero of the Soviet Union while he lay comatose. When he finally recovered enough to stand, he returned to the Air Force, initially as an instructor, then as deputy commander of the 144th Fighter Regiment. Soviet records credit Kovzan with 28 aerial victories, though modern historians consider that figure inflated by wartime propaganda. What remains indisputable are the 4 ramming attacks. More than any other pilot in history survived. 17 other Soviet pilots achieved 2 confirmed ramming attacks during the war. None survived 4. By 1945, VVS records documented 636 successful Taran attacks total, destroying German aircraft that Soviet guns couldn't bring down. The tactic influenced post-war Soviet fighter doctrine. Training manuals included ramming as a last resort technique. Aircraft designers reinforced propeller assemblies and nose structures to better withstand collision loads. The willingness to ram, to literally crash into an enemy, became part of Soviet aerial combat psychology that would persist through the Cold War. German bomber crews who fought on the Eastern Front never forgot the fighters that didn't stop attacking when their ammunition ran out. There's a line between desperation and innovation so thin it's almost invisible. Boris Kovzan stood on that line for 10 months in 1941 and 1942, proving that what seems like suicide can become survival when practiced with enough precision. The Soviet Air Force flew obsolete aircraft against a superior enemy. Their guns couldn't penetrate armor. Their ammunition ran out too quickly. By every conventional measure, they should have lost the air war over Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. Instead, they weaponized their weakness. They transformed the very crashes that marked Kovzan as an incompetent pilot into a technique that terrified German bomber crews. The pilot who couldn't land safely became the pilot who could crash deliberately and live. What makes Kovzan's story remarkable isn't the courage. Hundreds of pilots showed equal bravery, but the repetition. Once is desperation. Twice is luck. 3 times is skill. 4 times is doctrine. The Luftwaffe spent the war assuming aerial combat had rules. Fighters shoot, bombers bomb, damaged aircraft disengage. Soviet pilots, facing annihilation, rewrote those rules. They proved that an aircraft doesn't stop being a weapon when the ammunition counter hits 0. It just becomes a different kind of weapon. 1 pilot, 4 rammings, 4 survival landings, 4 German aircraft destroyed that guns alone couldn't bring down. Sometimes the most heroic thing isn't avoiding the crash. It's learning to crash better than anyone thought possible. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.